Yuba-Sutter.live's local government live streams are presented by Plumas Lake Self Storage in Plumas Lake, where lifelong local residents are helping other residents keep things safe, providing indoor storage units, outdoor RV and vehicle parking, moving supplies, and Penske truck rentals. Details at plumaslakeselfstorage.com.
Did you want to do Pledge of Allegiance?
Sure, we can start there.
Okay.
So, Director Vasquez, will you lead us in the pledge?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And now we'll do roll call.
Of course. Director Vasquez?
Yes, here.
Director Blazier?
Here.
Director Fear?
Yes.
Director Bradford?
Here.
Director Missick?
Here.
Director Bishop? Director Matthews?
Here. Great, thank you. Next up is public comment.
Public comment is an opportunity for members of the public to address the Board of Directors on any subject matter that is not on the meeting agenda and is within the board's subject matter jurisdiction. Public comment periods are limited to 3 minutes per person, and the total amount of time for public comment is 15 minutes. Persons participating by way of video conference or teleconference shall ensure their audio is muted at all times except when the board clerk announces public comment periods. At this designated time, members of the public wishing to speak shall enable their audio and state their name for the record. When multiple members of the public wish to speak, the clerk will determine the order of speakers and announce their names accordingly. To ensure proper conduct, the board reserves the right to mute the audio and video of any member of the public, violating generally accepted principles and decorum of official public meetings.
Great, thank you. Is there any cards from the public or any hands raised on Zoom? Okay. Seeing no public comment, we will move on to the consent items. There's one item listed under consent. Is there any public comment on consent?
Move to approve.
Okay. Have a first? I have a second. All in favor of approving consent, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, excellent. With that, we will move on to discussion items, starting with item 2. Consider approval of an $8,500 sponsorship of the 2023 National Waterways Conference annual meeting. Good morning, Adam.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and Directors. Adam Robin, Government Relations Manager, here today to present this sponsorship proposal to the board. As you all know, pursuant to the sponsorship policy, any sponsorship in excess of $2,500 is brought to you for your approval. So the National Waterways Conference will be coming to Sacramento October 2nd through 4th. This is their annual meeting. The National Waterways Conference is a national membership-based organization. Their membership consists of entities, public agencies, other organizations that do close work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. As you know, the Army Corps operates and maintains critical facilities on the Yuba River, and they're an important partner for the state and local agencies on a variety of flood risk reduction projects in Yuba County and across the region as well. The annual meeting, the event that'll be coming to Sacramento in early October, is really distinguished by high levels of participation from senior leadership at headquarters U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Washington, as well as from the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. These are folks who don't come out to the California or the Central Valley all too often, so it's a really great opportunity to connect with those critical audiences. National Waterways Conference has invited us to be a gold sponsor of the conference. Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency has done a lot of work to bring this conference and this event and this audience to Sacramento, and we'd like to be there as one of the leading sponsors of this event as well. So we request permission to sponsor the conference at that $8,500 level. That's the gold sponsorship level. It's 2 ticks below the platinum or diamond top level sponsorship, but it'll provide Yuba Water personnel with really important benefits like access to the conference, It'll allow us to screen a 2-minute video as part of the conference program, which could be the Tricky Yuba trailer or some other awesome product that we can develop. And it'll really kind of put us above the fold and show us, demonstrate our leadership as one of the leaders in flood risk reduction in California and in the Central Valley with this important audience. So with that, I'm available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Any questions from the board?
And who's attending? On the board.
Are there opportunities for board members to attend who are interested in
Absolutely.
addition to staff? Okay. Are there interested board members? Okay. I know I'm possibly interested as well. So I think board members that are interested could speak to staff and learn more about the opportunities to participate. So great.
We are a member of the National Waterways Conference. I think one thing that's noteworthy about it is, as far as membership commitments go, it's a fairly modest, annual membership structure to participate in the organization. It's a lean organization. They have one professional staff person, and they have consultants who actually manage things. It's really membership driven in terms of generating content. And since we joined a year ago, it's been very impressive the amount of work that they get done, utilizing the expertise of their members on common interests surrounding engagement with the Corps of Engineers.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any additional questions from the board?
So move, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, great. I have a first. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, any public comment on this item? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No, great. Thank you, Adam. Okay, next we'll move on to item 3, consider adoption of resolution 2023-02, adopting a CEQA Mitigated Negative Declaration for the South Canal Diversion Water Supply and Fish Passage Enhancement Annual Maintenance Project, making CEQA findings, approving project, and approving related actions. Morning, Ryan.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Ryan McNally, your Director of Water Resources and Flood Risk Reduction. Before you this morning is a resolution for the board to adopt a CEQA Mitigated Negative Declaration for the South Canal Diversion Annual Maintenance Project. Staff is currently working with regulatory agencies to acquire the appropriate permits to renew our ability to clean the river channel leading to the South Diversion. As you probably know, that's how we deliver surface water to virtually all of South Yuba County. After high water events, the diversion channel tends to become obstructed with gravels and debris, and that restricts flows to the diversion itself. And this mitigated negative declaration is one of the requirements in acquiring the permits necessary to perform that maintenance work. So staff is just asking the board to consider a resolution that would adopt that negative declaration.
Great,
I'm
thank you.
happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from the board? I have one question. Did we previously have an annual maintenance, or did we have to kind of go each time? And is this a new thing to be able to get an annual maintenance?
It was what we're shooting for right now is what we're calling a long-term maintenance agreement, which is, I believe it's 7 years. Before, I think we had a 5-year agreement.
Okay.
So it wasn't every year.
Okay.
Last year was an outlier because our maintenance agreement only allowed us to get into the channel between July 1st and August 30th. So we needed to get in there a little bit earlier. So we worked with the regulatory agencies who leaned pretty far forward, from our experience to help us get in there. And we were able to complete that work in May.
Great. Well, I'm glad to see we'll have more years, longer duration of the permit, as well as a longer time that we can be in the river and make sure that we get water to the districts down south. So appreciate staff's effort on this. Any public comment on this item? Okay. Is there a motion? Okay.
I'll second it.
Have a first and a second. You can pick Mandy. So all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Hearing none, we will move on to item 4. The board will receive a presentation from the Director of Water Resources and Flood Risk Reduction about the Yuba Water Flood Risk Management Plan.
So,
We just need to set up.
okay, well, I'll give my introduction. Okay, cool. Okay, so a couple meetings ago, Ryan and John gave you guys an update on our flood risk management program overall. And we mentioned at that meeting that today we'd be bringing you a plan that we executed almost 2 years ago now with HDR Consulting to prepare for us, which is basically a long-term plan or study on what is the next best set of investments that Yuba Water Agency can make for flood risk reduction in Yuba County. we spent a lot of time and effort on this, and today is a presentation summary of what those findings are, and it's basically to give you all a vision of what future investments in flood risk reduction in Yuba County could look like. So it's just a presentation. We're not asking for any action today. It's basically another layer of specificity on our flood risk management program. Like I said, a couple weeks ago was like the overall program. This is looking into the future on what we've done and what we could do going forward. And obviously, specific policy decisions will be brought to you individually, like the ARC spillway or any other actions we do with flood risk reduction. So this is informational only, but its purpose is to give you guys information, but also to cause a discussion. So if there are questions, feel free to stop us and ask the questions, or at the end, of course, we'll have time for overall generalized questions as well. So this is a conversation piece.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Willie. So again, just for the record, Ryan McNally, Director of Water Resources and Flood Risk Reduction. And as Willie mentioned, last month, John and I gave a presentation regarding the flood risk reduction program at the water agency. And we teased this plan that we've been working on for, I think, a little over a year now with our consultants, HDR, who will help me out here in just a minute with some of the more technical details. As we get started, you may recall last month's last month's presentation. I left with this slide, and I kind of use this as a shameless way to set the tone as we talk about why this plan is so important. I think, it's been it's been decades since the 1997 event, and it's a good reminder of how catastrophic flooding can be for the people of Yuba County. And I don't think anything tells a story quite like this graphic. So just wanted to set a little context here with this slide as well as the next slide. This slide is a brand new graphic that our communications team has just put together, attempting to illustrate the magnitude of events that have occurred over the last 73-ish years, starting in 1950. And each of the bars in the bar chart represent flows of over 100,000 CFS at the confluences of the Yuba and Feather rivers. So as you can see, these happen with some degree of frequency. It's not just a one-in-a-lifetime type event. These are all major events. I mean, obviously, standouts are 1955, 1964, 1986, and 1997. But anything over 100,000 CFS in the river is significant. And there's a potential for loss of life and property. So this is why we do what we do. This is a demonstration of what we need to plan for. This slide illustrates our flood risk management efforts from 1998 to 2020. Over the past several decades, Yuba Water and our local, state, federal partners have conducted more than a dozen studies and implemented several major projects and programs to reduce flood risks within Yuba County, the surrounding Yuba-Sutter region, as well as downstream communities. Again, the graphic shows flood risk management efforts in Yuba County over the past 2 decades. Looking at the oldest study on the slide, 1998 Federal Yuba River Basin Investigation recommended levee improvements in RD 784, the city of Marysville, and others, including the ARC spillway, which is shown in green. That was first identified and recommended in the 2002-2003 Yuba Feather Supplemental Flood Control Project feasibility studies, and we have continued to compare alternative configurations and optimize the design of this measure in combination with forecast-informed reservoir operations as recently as 2020. So the purpose of the study we're talking about today is to take inventory of all these recent past efforts and reevaluate them in light of current conditions and prioritize them to address the remaining flood risks within Yuba County. And again, in spirit with our predecessors' vision and intent to protect our community from flood water, we recognize flood risk reduction will always be a work in progress and is never complete. It's clear that we needed to look beyond many of these studies on this slide and set our sights toward the future and ask, what are the next projects for flood risk reduction in Yuba County? So looking at these 5 boxes in the planning process, the box in the upper left represents the studies called out on the previous slide. So there was a dozen or so studies there on the last slide. That's in the upper left box. That's what that represents. But the box next to it represents extensive outreach to our partners to learn what their needs are. And when I say partners, I'm talking about our boots on the ground experts at the local levee districts, emergency managers at the county, and community development professionals, as well as the state of California. There was a comprehensive outreach conducted by our team for all of those stakeholders to learn what their needs were, and pretty comprehensive assessment of what their position was in flood risk reduction. The box in the upper right represents Yuba Water's 2017 to 2022 strategic plan, which did a good job identifying many of the agency's short-term objectives in flood risk reduction. Those three boxes then informed the new flood risk management study, which is represented in the box on the lower left. But you'll also notice a set of two-way arrows pointing to and from the 2023 and 2028 Yuba Water Agency strategic plan. Now, it's worth mentioning that as we developed the new strategic plan, many of the elements relating to strategic priority number 1, which is flood risk reduction, which we talked about last month, were informed by the elements of the plan still in draft form. It's also worth noting that elements that were central to the strategic plan, including protecting the people of Yuba County from floodwater, influenced the flood risk management study that we're talking about today. So it was really a two-way. They were developed in conjunction with one another, understanding what the needs were for Yuba County currently and moving forward. And so it's important that the plan embodies not only who we are and what we do, but also provides direction for the best projects that make both practical and economic sense, not only to just Yuba Water, but also to our partners, because they're the boots on the ground. Those are the people who are protecting the people of Yuba County. So with that, this slide, I would like to invite our colleagues at HDR up to talk a little bit more about the technical pieces of the plan. And then I'll talk here again in a few minutes.
Good morning, board members. Morning. Can you all hear me okay? Is this better? Great. My name is Avery Livingood. I'm a water resources planner at HDR, and I'm joined today by my colleague Nathan Pingle, senior water resources engineer at HDR. And I'll be presenting a high-level overview of our approach to the flood risk management planning study. So for purposes of this study, we used the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers definition of flood risk, which is shown on the slide. Flood risk is defined as a function of the probability that a flood will occur and the consequences if a flood does occur. You can think of different size flood events. A smaller flood event would typically have a higher probability of occurring but lower consequences, and a larger flood event would typically have a lower probability of occurring and higher consequences. How do I advance slides? There we go. Consequences, in turn, are a function of the hazard as well as the exposure. So in the top blue row in this graphic, you'll see that the hazard is modified by the performance of the system. That's referring to the performance of your dams, your levees, your other flood control infrastructure. And that's what we normally think of as level of protection. But level of protection alone doesn't really give you much information about what is being protected. So the bottom row in red is showing that consequences are also dependent on the exposure and vulnerability of the people and the buildings that are potentially in harm's way. So if there are no people and no buildings exposed to a flood, regardless of how big that flood is, the consequences are very small. Whereas if there's a city or a large population of people in harm's way, the consequences can be much greater. So while we often in the flood control space talk about level of protection, and that is an important metric, it's just one piece of the overall flood risk equation. And so I wanted to highlight this for you because going into our goals, we'll be talking a little bit more about flood risk. So with that framing in mind, we worked with Yuba Water Agency staff to establish goals and objectives for the study. And as Ryan mentioned, we were working kind of in concert with your efforts on the strategic plan to make sure those goals are complementary. So these goals and objectives are distinct from the strategic plan. They're focused on the study itself, but we hope that they are complementary to your new strategic plan. The primary goal that we established is to reduce flood risk to the lowest level practicable. So this means improving the level of protection where feasible, but also accounting for residual risk and the potential for risk to grow through ongoing population growth, new development in new urban areas, and the uncertainties surrounding climate change. The three other goals that are shown on this slide are secondary to that primary goal, so I'll just read through them Quickly, goal 2 is to increase the flexibility and resilience of flood control facilities and operations. Essentially, that's kind of maximizing your use of your existing flood control infrastructure. Goal 3 is to increase local maintenance and emergency response capacity, both in your downstream levied areas and upstream of New Bullard's Bar, where there's increased wildfire risk and risk of debris flows. And goal 4 is to demonstrate proactive environmental stewardship, both to protect the environment and hopefully facilitate permitting for implementation of flood risk management measures. So Ryan already touched on this a little bit, but in order to meet these goals, we needed to take stock of the work that your agency has already done over the past several decades, and the work that others in the county have done to date. And then identify flood risk reduction measures to kind of fill in any of the remaining gaps or needs. So to do this, we used 2 primary sources of information. The first was a comprehensive review of past studies and plans that have been conducted for Yuba County and the Yuba-Feather region. Some of these, the key studies are shown on this slide. We looked as far back as the 50s, the 1957 California Water Plan. And we inventoried all of the flood risk management measures that were considered in these plans and then documented whether the studies had eliminated the measure, recommended the measure, and or if the measure had been implemented to date. So kind of had a pretty large database of potential flood risk reduction measures from that effort. And then we supplemented that with a second data source, which was the partner input that Ryan mentioned. We conducted structured interviews with 4 of the reclamation districts in Yuba County, and that was both to ground truth some of our understanding about the remaining flood risk management needs in each of the districts, and also to gather input on the different types of flood risk reduction measures that each district could see being effective in their area. And then additional measures were identified through more informal discussions with your staff, as well as staff from Yuba County, the City of Wheatland, and the state DWR. So this slide has a lot going on, and I'm not going to try to read through all of the numbers, but the main message here is that we conducted a preliminary screening process on all of the measures that had been eliminated in the past studies to see whether or not we should reconsider them in light of current conditions. So out of the 100-some odd total measures that had been identified through those 2 data sources, we found 48 that were previously eliminated, and they went through a 3-stage screening process. The first step was to look at whether the original screening criteria were still valid under current conditions. And so one example of that is the 2003 Yuba-Feather Flood Control Feasibility Study screened out all measures that were not eligible for a very specific type of state grant funding that was available at that time. That funding is no longer available. It's been 2 decades since then. And so that's no longer really a valid reason for not considering those measures. So we kept those measures in and brought them on to step 2. At stage 2, we were screening measures based on their feasibility or infeasibility based on current conditions. So that includes legal, regulatory, environmental, and economic constraints. And one example of measures that were screened out at this stage were measures that would conflict with the Wild and Scenic River designation on the South Yuba River. There's a lot of historic flood control measures that have been proposed on the South Yuba River. Those are no longer viable due to the Wild and Scenic River designation, so those were screened out. And then finally, in stage 3, we looked at whether the measures were within Yuba Water Agency's flood control authority. So if a measure was dependent on modifications to a facility that's owned by a different agency outside of the county, and Yuba Water Agency has very limited control over that, we screened those measures out. So at the end of this very detailed process, we ended up with 6 previously eliminated measures that we brought forward for a full evaluation. And in addition to those 6 previously eliminated measures, we also considered 13 measures that had been previously recommended but have not yet been implemented, as well as 2 new measures that were identified through partner input. So overall, 21 measures were evaluated, and for the evaluation, we used a multi-criteria decision analysis process, which is a fancy way of saying we used multiple criteria and we gave them scores qualitatively in these 4 categories. So that's what's shown on the screen. The criteria were readiness, support for goals, potential impacts, and acceptability. So readiness meant the degree to which a measure has already progressed into design or permitting, or if funding has been identified already, it was given a higher score. Support for goals meant that if a project or a measure could potentially achieve more than 1 goal, it was given a higher score than if it could only achieve 1 goal. The potential for adverse impacts, these were scored kind of in the opposite. So fewer adverse impacts would give a measure a higher score, whereas greater potential adverse impacts would result in a lower score. And then finally, acceptability. This is referring to public acceptability. And so for this, we looked at the likelihood that a measure would require significant land acquisition. That reduced the scores that were given to each measure. And then whether measures would have potentially multiple benefits like recreation opportunities, environmental restoration opportunities, the potential for additional water supply. Those multiple benefits were given a higher score for this criteria. So once we had the scores for each of the criteria, we calculated a weighted average. That was the total score. And any measure that scored above the mean was prioritized. Buttons mixed up. So this slide on the left-hand side is just a high-level summary of all those flowcharts that I just spoke to, with the end result that we had 14 prioritized measures. And the measures that were not prioritized, those aren't necessarily off the table. This just means that they're not as high of a priority based on the evaluation process that we went through. The prioritized measures fall into 6 general categories. We have forecast-informed reservoir operations, which you're already actively engaged in, modifications and improvements to facilities at New Bullards Bar, modifications and improvements to downstream levees, support for maintenance and repairs to those downstream levees, and then floodplain management activities and emergency preparedness activities. So what the modifications and improvements would be to New Bullards Bar. Yep, I don't want to misspeak, so. Oh, that's okay. I'm almost to the last slide, so this is good timing. So the Colgate Powerhouse Tailwater Depression is one of those sort of projects that's already been pretty well developed. It's a simple, it's already pretty well developed and could be implemented pretty easily relative to some of the other measures, and would provide additional release capacity and multiple benefits of power generation during high flow events. So that was one of them. The ARC spillway was definitely another priority implementation measure. I think those are the key 2 related to New Bullards Bar. We also evaluated a dam raise that had been evaluated multiple times in past studies, but that ranked lower in the prioritization scheme. So that is not among the 14. Yes, you're welcome.
Yes.
Could you put page 12 back up, please?
Can you stop me when I get there?
Well.
Oh, there we go. I see the page number.
Under the questionnaires and interviews.
Yes.
You left off Reclamation District 10.
We attempted to contact Reclamation District 10 a couple of times and were unable to get a response.
I can't hear you. Say it.
We attempted to reach Reclamation District 10 a couple of times and were unable to reach out to them. So instead, we spoke with one of their district engineers. So a consulting firm that works with them, we spoke with them instead since we were unable to speak directly to RD10.
but since you also had things like the Bullard's Bar, which wouldn't be in the questionnaire, don't you have prior recommendations from Reclamation District 10 on what needed to be done to bring their standards up to 100-year level?
Yeah, so some of the other, I'm going to go back to the prioritization slide. Some of the other measures that were prioritized included levee improvements and support for improved levee maintenance. And those were really the things that most of the RDs are really focused on, including at least the district engineer noted that RD10 would really benefit from additional O&M and staffing support for their levee O&M.
And then are the studies you quoted here, are they available to the board?
Oh, yes. We actually got the studies from your staff, so they have the inventory. And
thank you.
Any other questions? I just have one more slide and then I'll turn it back to Ryan. So the study itself has a whole chapter on recommendations to help Yuba Water Agency advance implementation of the 14 prioritized measures. And that includes everything from potential funding sources to potential partner organizations that could help to implement or even take the lead on implementation. And I don't have time to get into those details, but I did want to highlight one recommendation that applies to all of the measures and that would be really helpful to advance progress on all of the recommended measures. And that is continued participation in local, regional, and state flood risk management planning and preparedness forums. So examples of this include the Yuba-Sutter Flood Emergency Response Working Group, which is focused on coordinated emergency operations, getting the county, your water agency, and the state staff kind of all on the same page for how to operate during flood events. And another is the Feather River Regional Flood Management Planning Group, or RFMP group, which helps to coordinate flood risk management planning needs at a regional level. And then the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, or CVFPP, update process. The 2022 process recently concluded last December, but another one will be underway soon enough. And this process helps to, or participating in this process helps to align local and regional flood management plans with those of the Greater Central Valley and state priorities to help increase the potential for state funding to implement your priority measures. So that's all I have. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Ryan to close out the presentation.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Any additional questions for? Okay.
Yeah, so again, today's was just a presentation, just a discussion, talking at a high level of the planning process that went into this, developing this plan. And I just wanted to close by saying, you know, I think it's no secret that Yuba Water's done great work since 1959. But we also weren't the agency we are today. You know, we're an agency blessed with a lot more resources and a lot more capacity to better protect the people of Yuba County. And so in the world of flood risk reduction, we're often reactive to flood events. And after 1997, we learned a lot. And today, as we get closer to accomplishing many of the flood risk reduction projects we've talked about in other presentations, all the work that Trillia has done, our partnering reclamation districts, a lot of projects are coming to a close. You know, we kind of looked at each other and thought, you know, what's next? What's next for the people of Yuba County? How do we protect from flood water? You know, after all these projects are wrapped up and on the books, what can we do next? And so that's when we initiated this planning study. And that's what this study really details. You know, what it provides a roadmap of moving forward. How do we protect the people of Yuba County? And I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah. Concludes the presentation. Any questions?
Thank you, Ryan. Any questions?
Maybe this is another presentation, but can you tell us what the projects are that came through this? And
So it was purposefully at a high level, just because we can spend hours getting out into the weeds with the criteria and everything. I will tell you, the ARC spillway above all ranks the highest. That's the next priority. There's to Director Matthews' comment, levee improvements to District 10 also rank very high. No north training walls associated with Trillia. The south training wall, they're all on the short list. So perhaps we can prepare another presentation that gets further into the details on why they're ranked a certain way, or so. But generally speaking, we have a very clear idea of what the next best flood risk reduction measures are for Yuba County. Of course.
So Director Bishop, that's an excellent question. And so the way I like to characterize what our effort is here is every generation of Yuba Water Agency kind of has a goal. We built the dam as our first direct improvement for flood risk reduction. We owned and operated that dam and paid for it, by the Don Wilson days. And then getting into the Kurt Akins days, Kurt started right after the 1997 flood, and there was the 2003 studies that Avery mentioned, which seems like 5-6 years after the flood. That seems like a long ways away, but those were like what I consider those were like biblical studies that we referred to when we did the Feather River Setback Levy and the Marysville Ring Levy. When you look at the things like do something with the facilities at New Bullards Bar, those were found, and do forecast coordinated operations. Those were foundational to that generation of levee improvement, flood risk reduction work. And we're getting close to being done with those. And you might laugh, well, we're not even close to being done with an arc spillway or an improvement at New Bullards Bar, but we're almost done with an engineering and design, and we need to look forward at, okay, what's next? And so this document and this kind of comprehensive look at what has been done over the past 60 years and what are our options going forward, that's what this is. And we intentionally did not want to jump into, give you 20 minutes of here's all the stuff that's been done and then go, okay, District 10 needs X, Y, and Z, and the North Training Wall needs, A, B, and C. That wasn't the intent here. The intent was to have one meeting where we say, we spent 1.5 years studying everything that's been going on the last 25 years. Here it is. We're going to get you a copy of this presentation. We're going to get you a copy of the studies. Like Director Matthews asked, if you want a copy of any detailed report or all the detailed reports that we referred to, you can have those. Then we'll have a future conversation about the resulting actions we will take, and we'll bring those to you. And we'll get your policy decisions. If you want us to focus on one area or another, or different aspect of an improvement, that's what we need from you all. But this was an introduction to the next phase of work that we plan on getting done. And we see this as our first action in responding to your new strategic plan that you approved in December.
Thank you. Any additional comment? Okay.
First of all, thanks for one of your first slides that showed an average of about every 5 years, because I think a lot of people miss that point. When we talk about 100, 200, 500 year protection, they think, why are we even doing this if it's 500 years out, But they don't realize that the frequency is more like 5 years of something that could happen. Thanks again for mentioning District 10. I didn't think it was off the chart, but I'm glad it was brought up. And I think we have a unique situation in the next 10 days, and maybe Willie's going to talk about this, I'm sure, that'll bring into focus what we've just been talking about, how it applies to today. That'll be interesting. Thanks.
Director Blazer, I just turned my microphone on to address that very thing. Do you mind bringing up the new slide that has the bar chart?
Of course.
One that Director Blazer mentioned. Okay, so Brian's going to bring up the latest slide that that shows the frequency of significant flooding in the basin the last 73 years. What I'd like to mention, and I'll mention my manager's report as well, is we're in a situation where we have a significant snowpack and we have a series of storms coming in. 2 to 3, what we're seeing as significant atmospheric rivers over the next 10 days, maybe potentially 16 inches of rain. Don't know how much is going to be snow. Don't know how much is going to be rain. My point, in whether Director Blazer asked this question or not, I was going to bring up the point that in every one of these scenarios, and we were in this scenario in January, you'll remember the first meeting of the year where I said, look, we may be in a 1997 situation, right? And we ended up not being, and we ended up being very mild. It wasn't even a 10-year event. But when you're sitting in that chair and you know where you're at in your reservoir, you know the capacity you have for flood space, which was a lot then, but less now, January 3rd compared to today, March 7th, you don't know what the forecast is going to be. So I said then, and I'll say it again, and this has been said, or at least thought by flood risk managers in every one of these events. It doesn't matter if it's one that reaches the darkest bar on the top or one that just barely reaches the yellow bar, you don't know what that error is going to be. You don't know, like in the next 10 days, you have an idea of the forecast, and you have idea that, yes, you're going to be in flood risk mode, but you don't know if it's going to be extreme, or you don't know if it's going to be less than extreme. And so the point is and we did this in January, we always need to be monitoring and being prepared for the 97 or worse event. And so I'm not saying that the next 10 days is going to be that, but we will monitor it and manage it accordingly. And that's what happened in every single one of these bars in the last 73 years. So that's what it means to be a flood risk manager. That's what it means to operate in coordination with both the big hitters, the DWR and the Army Corps and the National Weather Service, but also the folks that live in District 10 and the folks that live in Hallwood and the bigger urban areas like 784. So the point is this is how frequently we get into flood operations. This is how important this is to the county. And needless to say, and I don't want to get dramatic and go back to the first slide, but the whole point is to save people's lives and to minimize the impact in the economy of Yuba County. And that goes back to the first slide, the dramatic slide that shows the non-flooded areas and the flooded areas. So that's the whole point here with this slide is the frequency and how often we're in this unknown of what's it going to be.
Director Matthews.
I would like you to make one more chart or add to this chart, and it would be the flood of 38, which inundated District 10. It would also be the 06 flood. Those were the two major events. But then I said to modify the chart. The reason 64 we didn't lose Marysville and Yuba City was because Oroville was partially built, and it took the water down to 160,000. In both 09 or 06 and 55, coming into Oroville was 190. But they closed off Hazelbush and raised the levees before the 55 flood. And of course, as we know, the channel capacity wasn't big enough. But the floods we've had since then are even stronger. So if you could work that in, it would be a much easier job of telling people, even though we have dams, things have been bigger since we've had them, and the dams have saved us.
Director Matthews, I hesitate. I try to be professional. And I want to make a joke about, do you remember 1862? But I won't. Because I know you remember these floods, and here's what I'll suggest. You and I have had these discussions, and you have done a great job of transferring what you do know from firsthand information that you experienced in your lifetime and stuff that you heard from your family. What I would like to do, and I would suggest based on your ask right now, is to have you sit down with the folks that put this plan together, including Yuba Water Agency staff folks that work on flood risk reduction, and interview you for an hour or 2 hours like you and I have done in one-on-one sessions to extract the knowledge that you have, and then they can go back and research that. And I'm not questioning you and your knowledge, but what I'm saying is we can hear from you what you saw, let's say in 1964, and we can go back and see if there's any literature, any documents out there that confirm it. Doesn't mean it's not true, but it would be nice to find out, what that really was. And if nothing else, we can document what you remember that occurred in these events. And I think that would be the next best step to acquire your knowledge and get it documented.
I have no problem with the accuracy of my knowledge.
So what I think Director Matthews was asking for, and I think it would be interesting to see if the data exists, is not necessarily a replacement for this chart, but an alternate chart that showed, if the dams if Oroville wasn't in place and if Bullard's Bar wasn't in place, what would the flow have been at the confluence in these bigger years, right? And so I think it tells a story of how important those reservoirs are for flood protection. If that's what I understood.
Exactly what I'm trying to do.
So assuming there's inflow data or stream data prior to, the dams being built, that'd be something to be interesting to compare, right? The difference. Here's the benefit that we had because of that.
Yeah, noted. And based on the discussion we'll have with Director Matthews and the resulting chart, we'll produce that.
Awesome.
And the data exists.
Cool. Any additional comments, questions from board members?
Question. Elevation, what would the elevation be of the ARC spillway release? I think you're at 1900 now. Am I reading this right? The elevation at Buller's Bar.
What are you reading? We're like 1915 now.
Yeah, 1915.
Yeah.
So what would the elevation be of the arc?
1873 and a half, something like that.
Okay, so we could be a situation today where you would probably use the arc spillway.
The situation today is unique. We've been capable of spilling since the storms in early to mid-January. The arc spillway, an example of use of the arc spillway is more the January storm. If the January storm would have been more significant. Yes, the arc spillway would allow operational flexibility in the system that we have today, or in the situation we have today. But it would be more advantageous in a situation where you weren't on the spillway. We are on the spillway today, 13 feet on the spillway, but it'd be more advantageous in a situation where you're not on the spillway and you see this big storm event coming and you can release even more than you can today because we are on the spillway.
So there's a possibility that it could, if you had it, you might use it in the next 10 days.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Would you also say that there's a component in power revenue? Because if you have the ability to evacuate before the storm, you would able to encroach into the flood storage because you could make up for it faster. Would that be an economic component that we should look at when we're talking about the cost of the spillway?
Yeah, and so the bottom line is yes, if your question is about the arc spillway, yes, the arc spillway provides operational flexibility. That's the advantage. Pre-release is the specific advantage, pre-release in ahead of a flood event. We will look at, and we have looked at, both economic advantages. One, water supply and the ability to be more flexible within the flood space to store more water in certain water years and certain conditions. And the other is to take advantage of water that is passing through Bullards, through the generators at Colgate, whether that's being able to encroach more often and generate out of encroachments, or the ability to generate later in the season without, during the snowmelt period, without having to spill, depending on, the operational flexibility that will be allowed in the resulting water control manual revision. That's the big key, is the water control manual revision and what it specifically will allow us to do with encroachments and this additional added flexibility.
And how much input do we have in that document?
Well, we have a significant amount of input. I mean, John's leading that effort, and he's meeting with the Army Corps, and we're walking through that effort, specifically hand in hand with the Army Corps of Engineers. We won't have a determination of what it exactly says. That's an Army Corps of Engineers document, but we attempt to influence it to our operational advantage as best we can within reason.
So if due to your operational advantage, would you be able to quantify that into megawatts of extra generation?
Like anything, we could model it. We can model it based on previous storms. We could take the 97 event and say in 97 we were limited to this, but with the new manual and the new spillway, we likely could do a different scenario. We will do that, and we have been doing that.
I'm not worried about the 1 in 500 years. I'm talking about the other 499 years when we don't have a maximum flood event, but the arch spillway would make us money.
It possibly allows us to be more flexible, and therefore allows us to potentially generate more and have more water supply. And we will model those benefits, and we have. We initially have modeled them based on what we think the Army Corps may allow us to do. Now, that's not written down yet, so we won't know what those actual benefits are until we have that water control manual.
But before we spent the money to build the spillway, would we know it before? Or?
We would have an idea. Yeah, there are two parallel efforts. The water control manual revision is going at the same time we're planning the arc spillway.
Just trying to get the income ahead of the expense.
We will have an estimate of what those benefits are, both on water supply and generation. But I will remind the board the purpose of the ARC spillway is for flood risk reduction. It's not for an economic advantage. So I know the economic advantage may influence the decision, but I will remind you that the purpose, and based on these studies in the 97 study that talked about a modification of New Bullard's Bar, which our modification primarily is the ARC spillway, that's the purpose of the ARC spillway.
Yeah, and the cost benefit ratio is one of the keys to getting other people to help us build it.
It's a factor, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Additional comments or questions? Any public comment on this item? Okay. Seeing none, Willie, report time. Thank you, Ryan.
Okay, so we talked about the major storms that are forecast. So that's really the news around our office right now is planning for those storms. We had an internal meeting this morning. We got the updated forecast yesterday afternoon. We got an internal meeting this morning, and we're looking at having to spill New Bullard's Bar. When we will initiate that spill and at what flows, we won't know probably until tomorrow. We'll be meeting with, well, John's actually meeting with some of the folks at DWR today. We have a formal meeting with DWR tomorrow, and we'll probably kick off the forecast coordinated operations protocols starting tomorrow, meaning we'll be meeting with the Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Water Resources, National Weather Service, and others, and having daily meetings about our spill and our flood risk operations in coordination with Orville. So that'll be at least a daily meeting, depending on how the storms go. It might be much more frequent than just daily, but that's really the event that's kind of you know, on our radar right now is operating for flood control. And like I said a minute ago, it all depends on how these storms unfold, whether we spill a significant volume of water or, you know, just a mild spill and get through the next couple weeks. That's what we're preparing for. Ryan will also coordinate with the local LDs and RDs and local flood risk managers and let them know where we are and what our spills are, and also the county OES. So that's where we're at with operations. We are at full load on Colgate and have been for several days. There was a PG&E line outage over the weekend that caused us to not be able to generate fully, but the whole point is get as much water out through the generators as you can versus having to spill it. That's been our attempt. But needless to say, this will be a Schedule 1 year. There's plenty of water in the system. You're all seeing the news with the snowpack, primarily in Southern California, because that's where the impacts are. But the snowpack in our watershed is also at record levels. So water supply is not an issue. Flood risk management is at this point in time, and I'll keep you posted, you know, daily as we go through this. And this is kind of the same situation we were in early January, where we just don't know what these storms are going to bring, and we'll operate to them once they come, and I'll keep you all posted. So with that, I'll stop. Related to the flood risk, I'll answer questions on that. I have more in my report, but that's what's happening right now.
Talk a little.
Yeah, Director Blazer. So the spillway elevation, the crest of the spillway, is 1,902 feet, and we are currently just below the flood pool, which is about we're hovering right around 1915. So we're 13 feet on our existing spillway. And we have been for several weeks. Director Matthews.
Could you talk a little bit about when you have a large snowpack and you have a warm rain, the large snowpack absorbs an awful lot of the rain before it moves. And I guess it's by elevation. You might lose the low snow, but we wouldn't lose the high snow in a warm rain at this time.
Did a great job, Director Matthews. Those are facts. I'll just add a little bit to it. It depends on the duration and intensity of the rain versus snow. So you might see on the news, we're going to see snow levels at 8,000 feet. That's very true. But how long are you seeing those snow levels? Is it for 4 hours or is it for the 4-day storm event? That's a big deal. The other one is the extent of the snowpack. And one thing we have today that this plays into the forecast informed reservoir operations kind of recipe is the extent of the snowpack. And we have much better information on how broad the snowpack is and how far it extends in the low elevations. And it doesn't take long to flip on the news right now and see a report on how low the snow is, down into Colfax, Grass Valley, Penn Valley, Dobbins. I was going up to the dam last week, and You get into Oregon House and there's 4 inches of snow on the ground. So the extent of the snowpack is a big deal too. That is basically precipitation that landed last week that hasn't made its way to the rivers yet and will in the next several days in these warm storm events. So, back to your point, Director Matthews, it's the duration and intensity of the rainfall versus snow, and it's also the extent of the snowpack. And your primary point is some of the rain that we'll experience in the next several days will be absorbed by the existing snowpack. It all doesn't run off. That's correct. Okay, I will move on then. The crew up at the plant is primarily, clearing storm debris and preparing for operations through the storm. The mini hydro has been separated from PG&E and just been providing power for the dam for the last several weeks. There's a problem with the main utility breaker that connects us to PG&E. Our contract with PG&E requires a certain amount of reliability for that little unit. It's not a major source of revenue for us. So our direction to the team is, look, and plus the road getting down to that is in terrible shape. So let's leave that little generator offline, supplying power to the dam. Don't worry about getting it back together or getting it back connected to PG&E at this time. Just let it sit and we'll get to it later. Narrows 1 did trip offline, I think the 22nd. It's been back online since the 28th. We were aware of some breaker issues. The main breaker that connects that generator to the grid has had problems. That was documented when we bought it from PG&E, and we fixed some of those issues, but we also, to be safe, had to have PG&E de-energize portions of those circuits so that we could work on those breakers and then re-energize them to the grid. So the restoration of that unit the last couple of weeks took longer than normal. It's back and moving water through the system. And again, I don't want to rip on Narrows 1 too much, but this is some of this stuff like maintenance on Narrows 1 is delayed maintenance. It's strategically delayed maintenance because we don't know where we're going to be with the license. So when we talk about performance of that unit in particular, we want to just keep in mind that was a strategic decision that we made a couple years ago when we acquired it. I'll skip. There's a lot of information on the atmospheric rivers that are our forecast. I'll skip through that. Bottom line is potentially 16 inches in the next 7 days. So like Director Matthews' question, how much is rain and snow and how much results in runoff or is stored in snow is the big question we'll be monitoring. Okay, with HR, we're pleased to welcome Anthony Adov, Tony, as our newest help desk technician. Tony, this is one of those great stories where Tony started as an intern for the agency and we ended up having a vacant position and we ended up hiring one of our interns. It's happened a few times and it happened with Tony, and I just want to welcome Tony to the team. It's one of those things where it's a formality, but Tony, if you're on, congratulations, and we're happy to have you as part of the team. We have several positions that were in some stage of recruitment. Those positions include a senior information security analyst, utility worker, licensing manager, water operations project manager, water resources manager, and electrical technician. And there's several other positions that we'll be hiring in the next month or so as well. So recruiting is challenging at this time, and we're doing our best. We're successful in some ways. I'll just give an example of ways we're not. We went through a recruiting process for a particular position the last several weeks. We had some viable candidates. We had one really just knock it out of the park. We made an offer and the offer was declined, unfortunately, for personal reasons. But it's an employee's market out there, candidates market out there right now. And we're experiencing that like everyone else in the workforce. On communications, the Appeal Democrat ran a story about the death of our former general manager, who I mentioned earlier in my report, Don Wilson. We were also mentioned in the Appeal Democrats coverage promoting a Day for Women, the Women's History Month event that took place last weekend at the Hard Rock. In community relations, we participated in the Bacchai Parade and the Day for Women. Yesterday, Alex staffed a booth at the Yuba County Library, introducing Yuba Water to a bunch of elementary school students. And upcoming events we're sponsoring include the Farm Bureau's Spring Fling and all of the local Little Leagues. And our next meeting is March 21st.
Great, thank you. Any questions from board members? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to board reports. Director Vasquez.
If possible, I'd like to adjourn in memory of Don Wilson. and see if we can get all 7 members to sign it. That would be nice. I'd like to get our 457 plan evaluated a little closer. I attended the presentation on human trafficking, and I talked to Senator Shannon Grove, and she's sponsoring a bill, Senate Bill 14. I don't know if we really need to, whether we could actually support that. And what that would do is would include human trafficking and a list of crimes that are defined as serious and violent under California law. It's not a serious and violent crime as is positioned now, but making the crime a strike under the 3-strike law. All right, that's pretty much it.
Great. Thank you, Director Vasquez. Director Blazer?
I'd like to, I guess, thank Dan Peterson again from Yuba County for the presentation he did, I think, at our last meeting on all the Yuba County drainage and public works, because he recognized the agency numerous times on the help that they've done to bring all this together. So it was really good, all the transparency on what's coming up, because there's, I think, more than the general public knows. But he had a nice report. I believe it's accessible on through their website also.
Thank you. Director Fier?
Springboarding off of that, there's going to be hopefully a grant such as we helped co-fund with West Linda, hopefully in the next couple of years for Olivehurst. That does not reach all of the areas of Olivehurst, just some major thoroughfares, but lots of side streets are still going to be left untouched even with that grant. The idea is to, although we will not be putting in sidewalks, curbs, and gutters on those side streets, to improve their stormwater drainage, redo the drainage ditches that are there currently. And so I'm hoping that with the water agency's help, they can fund that portion outside of the grant that's going to do the curbs and gutters for the main part. So hopefully they'll be reaching out to you guys about that. I went to the Oroville Dam Advisory meeting and had a couple of interesting presentations. So my question to you, they take all of their trees that come down as debris, take it off to one part with tugboats and nets, I assume, to one part, and then they burn it. How do we do our debris removal for our lake?
We've tried various methods. So we have burned on the shoreline. We've actually burned on a platform on the barge, or on a barge on the lake. The most recent significant volume, I mean, annual maintenance is not normally a big deal. That's what we do. We pull it to the side and we burn it. But when you get major inflows like 2017, we pull the material to our utility boat ramp, use an excavator, load it on a dump truck, and haul it away. Okay. It's just, it takes so much effort to try and burn it in those years that it's a nuisance throughout the recreation season. And it just takes a lot of our time and effort. And so we contract that out. So multiple methods depending on the severity of the inputs.
Yeah, I saw some of the pictures of how much from when they have a forest fire, how much flows into their lake, and it was like a large portion of their lake was just full of debris netted off, and it was interesting. The second thing I talked to when I talked to the Department of Water Resources afterwards is some people had proposed a secondary spillway for Oroville Dam, but when they do their calculations and estimations of value, and perhaps I misunderstood because the number seems incredulous to me. He said it would take a 20,000 year event for it to be worthwhile for them, it seemed like, to do a spillway. And so I was just curious, is there some other understanding I could possibly have of that, or because of the way that the dam is situated where they're looking at doing it, was that accurate, a 20,000 year event?
You know, I don't want to say that it's not. I haven't looked at their, I don't know if their critical needs assessment for the past couple of years addresses this or if it's a separate study. But, and this is a little bit of a generalization, but every system is different and every dam is different. That dam is on the main stem of the feather. You know, ours is on just the North Yuba. I'm not surprised that's their answer. It's absolutely possible. Okay. And it's also, I mentioned the water control manual and the specific protocols used to operate even existing conditions, you know, maximize or minimize benefits. The one difference between the water control manual at Oroville versus our water control manual is they have a wetness factor, meaning theirs is a little more detailed, both kind of the same vintage, late 60s, early 70s water control manuals, but theirs takes into account the precipitation, in particular the snow that has fallen in the watershed dictates where their minimum storage is, where ours doesn't. Ours is 170,000 acre feet, and it's just time based or date based. So there's many. I'm just using that as an example of each watershed is different. So they may be getting more out of their existing conditions based on both the physical ability of the dam and the hydrology and their protocols or requirements.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Director Messick?
I would just ask that if you start spilling or when you know you're going to start spilling, if you could let me know so I can let the people along the river know.
Absolutely. We'll let you know.
Thanks.
We do plan, if depending on when we spill and how we initiate that, we'll try and get, some video of it and get it on social media.
And please let the entire board know about that. Okay. Director Matthews?
I'd like to also add my condolences to the Wilson family. I was here when we hired Don and spent many times driving with the pod committee to Sacramento, and he had a Ford something that was prone to tip over. So I encouraged him to let me do the driving since I was the slowest driver of the four of us, and we had many good times in Sacramento, and Don was very influential, especially when we went back to Washington, D.C., and McGill and myself testified and started the original things with the agencies back there. So Don was the first time he'd been to D.C., and he was very interested in seeing the raising the flag on Iwo Jima and the cemetery across, and he was very moved when he saw it.
Thank you, Director. Director Bishop?
I just want to report I attended the Water 101 session a couple of weeks ago, one day in the classroom and one day touring, and it was really incredibly, informative and time well spent. And one of the neat things was I was not the only one from Yuba Water Agency there. Mandy was there, and I forget the other two ladies' names from the accounting office. But I think it's a pretty neat thing that we give that opportunity to anybody on staff in the agency to learn more about the business we're in and be informed about it. I think that's great. And I learned a lot, filled in a lot of gaps in my knowledge, but one of the maybe more alarming things was there was a legislative staffer there from the Assembly who talked about how bills become law. And at the end of his talk, somebody asked him, well, what are you working on now that has to do with water? And he said, well, there's definitely a push to modernize water rights. And which means, modernize is a term that people use when they want to take other people's water, I think. So I don't know, for me, it was alarming being new to this, and maybe these are talks that go on all the time. So I don't know how much more serious the issues are now than they have been. I know we have people watching that, and that's certainly a good thing that we do. Got it. Oh, I'm leaving tonight for the Lower Colorado River tour, which I'm excited about.
Awesome. That you'll learn a lot there as well. Be a great trip.
Yeah.
So,
through the chair, I'd like to ask a question. John mentioned, Supervisor Messick mentioned about people on the river. Have we done any exploration on the river to find any of the camps that they have out there? They're usually not well-traveled areas. We'd hate to spill and have 6 or 7 camps get flooded, but just as a precautionary measure to look out for people on the river.
Yeah, I assume that's something that in our meetings with OES and Yuba County that we inform them of so that they can take those actions. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we have a notification protocol for the sheriff and county OES, and we will make those notifications per protocol. But I will also just make you all aware, and this is something we'll specifically tell the sheriff and the county, and just because we're spilling water at New Bullards Park doesn't mean we're going to be delivering a peak flow in the lower Yuba River that hasn't been seen this year. Remember, we had these major storms in January, and there isn't any control of the middle and the south Yuba. I think, I may be wrong here, I think we saw something like 35,000 cubic feet per second. we'll very likely only spill 5,000. So, I mean, this is not going, we may get up to 35,000. We'll continuously update both the sheriff and OES, but the initial spill and the initial event won't be even close to what we've seen as a peak this year. So, I mean, I don't want to say that there's going to be no impact on the river, but this is not going to be above and beyond an impact that we've recently seen.
Thank you. Anything else, Director Bishop? Okay, great. Thank you. So it was nice to see agency staff at the Bacchae Parade. There was quite a few agency staff there, and it looked like they were having a great time. So thank you to all the staff that participated in that. Also, last Friday, I was able to go to the NACWA annual meeting up in Chico, and we had multiple staff attend that as well. And so it was great to spend some time with them, as well as with water leaders from across the Sacramento Valley watershed. That's a great organization. And to your point, Director Bishop, they've also been flagging and monitoring. They're one of the groups that is certainly paying a lot of attention to the, quote, modernized water rights and what that means and what the attempts are there. So they're one of the groups trying to make sure that, you know, that as that effort moves forward, it doesn't, you know, it isn't detrimental to people's water rights. So.
And I could also add to that when Brent Hasty was the chairman of AQUA, he came back and told our board that there was a tremendous push in the South to modernize water rights. And he thought in the long-term discussions that water rights might get modified.
Thank you. Okay, anything else from staff? Okay, with that, we will adjourn. There is an ABP meeting at, is it 10:30? 10:30. And so for those of you on that, and that's over at the agency. So thank you very much. Meeting adjourned.
Yuba-Sutter.live's local government live streams are presented by Plumas Lake Self Storage in Plumas Lake, where lifelong local residents are helping other residents keep things safe, providing indoor storage units, outdoor RV and vehicle parking, moving supplies, and Penske truck rentals. Details at plumaslakeselfstorage.com. Skip's Marysville Music Cafe, with lessons in person and personalized. Instruments including guitars and amps, horns, strings for instruments, and a myriad of music and sound equipment. Skip's Marysville Music Cafe.